Okay. Give it 2 more minutes, because I know we have one more. Everybody have a good summer? Make lots of money? Yeah. Everybody have lunch? This is kind of during that time of day. It's a hard time to have class because it's warm and probably just ate. So you're getting drowsy. And we can't open the window. So we'll just do our best. Would y'all prefer to have the door open or closed?
Closed.
Okay. Maybe I can borrow that and go down back with my car after this. That's not me. Thank goodness. Okay, welcome. So, kinesiology. So this is one of your required courses for HHP, and some of you are here for an elective, which is fun. It's a good class. So this is more of an applied type of class. So taking things that you learned in anatomy and physiology, and then learning how to apply it. So for example, next week you'll have lab either on Monday or Wednesday, and we'll do the functional movement screen. So we have several brand new functional movement screen kits, and we'll divide up into groups. Welcome. And then that'll be Monday's lab. So please come ready to do half of the functional movement screen, whether you're in lab on Monday or Wednesday. So that's in this building, room 134. So if you're not sure where 134 is, after class today, if you'd like, I can walk down with you and we can just walk by there and I can show you where that is located. Try to be on time. A lot of the labs are an hour and a half. Kinesiology lab is just an hour. So it's very important that we're able to start on time so I can have all the procedures explained with everyone at once, and then we can jump in and go. So with your lab, it's a separate course shell. So that's important to know is it's not the same as the lecture course shell that you see here. So you'll have a separate lab course shell. I've already started loading material in for the functional movement screen. Because we do the first half in week 1 and second half in week 2, I put those all in one folder. So make sure you come ready for those tests. You know, it needs to be good exercise type clothing, something that you could do a squat in, footwear that's appropriate. So you've had labs before, so you know what to do. For lecture, glad you're all back for fall. You do need a book. I don't mind if you get the used book. You should try to bring your book and laptop to class. I know how finances are, and if you'd like to buy a book between 2 or 3 of you, that's fine. I just need to make sure that if we do a class activity that everyone in some way has access to a textbook. So find out, just a few of you. I know textbooks are outrageously expensive, and I can relate. So 2 or 3 of you pool your resources and just get one textbook, it'd be fine. Throughout the course, you can always go to the course outline. We'll go over that in a moment. But anything else we do, at this point, all I have is a PowerPoint folder here, but there'll be other folders with assignments and things. So I try to be as organized as possible. So if you miss something, you can email me and then I can refer you to the appropriate folder where you can have access to the assignment. So I know that you've got lots of things going on in your life, so if you're going to miss, don't just assume that I'll just send you the material. Make sure that you communicate with me, and I'd be happy to work with you to help you stay caught up. So for grades, I like to keep the grade book caught up, and you can just go under that and see what your scores are at any point in the semester. So for the course outline, my office hours are just before this class. So if there's anything you want to talk about, I just had my lunch, so bring your lunch and talk about the class. Come in, or Tuesday and Thursday 9 to 10 or 1 to 2. So you can come in anytime with questions. I also look at my email several times a day, so feel free to email if you have a question about anything. I think that's it on that part. So the objectives of this course revolve around learning different parts of the body in terms of muscles, bones, and nerves. So it's a wonderful textbook, and I've been using it for several years. I think we're using the 20th, but I think it's in the 21st edition now. So you'll learn all the nerves, all the major muscles, and then all of the major joints, especially with practical focus. So the progression is really logical. So you start out with some foundational material in the first 3 chapters. Beginning in chapter 4, you go to the shoulder girdle, progressing down to the shoulder joint, elbow, radial, ulnar joints, then the wrist and hand. And then the second half of the book, you're into the hip and pelvic girdle, knee joint, ankle joint, and then we talk about everything in the middle that connects the arms and legs, so the trunk and spinal column. And then all through that, we talk about practical stuff, so how to analyze movement. So the things that we talk about to analyze movement, we talk about prime movers, joint actions, planes, and axes of motion. So chapter 12 in your textbook, notice, is on movement analysis. We do movement analysis right from day 1. So by the time you get to chapter 12, you won't need it anymore because you'll already have done that the whole semester. So in terms of your grade, very straightforward. The points that you earn out of the points possible. I do take into account things like effort. So if you're sitting at a B+, and I can see that you've made a good effort and your scores have improved and you're attending and trying, I'm happy to get you up to that A-. So, or if it's a C+ to a B- and so on. So straight percentage, but there is some subjective parts to that before I give you that final grade. We will have lots of in-class assignments starting today. So there are 2 articles that you'll be asked during lecture today to open, and one of them you'll need to answer some questions. So I'll ask you to put your name on the top of a sheet of paper and you'll answer some questions. So it's just participation points, which, you know, if you figure 5 participation points per class period, and we have, 32 class periods? That can really add up. That's 150 points for just coming and trying to do the the participation and applied stuff. So then we have some exams. I do post study guides for the exams, so pay attention. Keep in mind the study guides are not answer keys, but they do help with guiding where you look for your focus on your study. Please turn in assignments on time. Again, I know things can happen. If something happens, please just send me an email and I can work with you on that. Okay, so our schedule, pretty straightforward. This is tentative, of course, just my best guess. Usually things change a little bit. This is 18 years for me teaching college. I started in Illinois and then moved here 6 years ago. So, and been teaching this the whole time. So it's a very familiar course, and my best guess is right here. So I think this will be pretty well the way it'll go. You'll notice that every exam includes a couple, maybe 2 or 3 chapters progressively. The final exam is not comprehensive, it's just the last chapters that we cover, so 9, 10, 11. So that'd be that Monday early on, so hopefully you'll be able to start your break a little bit early. So just some other resources here. All the stuff that faculty are asked to put in their course outline. Are there any questions that you have? Okay, all right, so well, let's jump in. So there are a couple articles that we'll get to. How many of you know that in 2013 a new ligament was discovered in the knee joint? Isn't that amazing? So we'll talk about that. And then some surprising facts about the skeleton. So we will get to those. These links are included in the PowerPoint, so when that time comes, I'll ask you to open those articles from the PowerPoint. Okay, so chapter 1. So this is a foundations chapter. So there's a lot of definitions and terminology in this chapter. So I'm going to provide some examples as we go. Not an example for everything because there's just so many, but as long as you understand what terms mean in terms of what inferior versus posterior and anterior and all that. So structural kinesiology. Kinesiology is the study of movement. So structural kinesiology, we study all the tissues that are involved with movement. So muscles, bones, nerves, connective tissue, all of the systems and tissues that work together to promote coordinated movement. So if you think about it, if you have problems with the nervous system, if you have problems with the skeletal system, if you have problems with the muscular system, your movement's going to be impaired in some way. So I'm sure you can think of disorders and other degenerative type conditions for the nervous system, muscular system, as well as the skeletal system that can interfere with efficient movement. So we study all of those and we isolate different regions of the body progressively. So joints can vary in both structure and function. We can classify joints based on their structure. Okay, so fibrous type joints, cartilaginous type joints, synovial type joints, or more importantly, because kinesiology is the study of movement, we can classify joints according to their function. So how much mobility do joints have? So some joints are immovable, some joints are slightly movable, and other joints are highly movable. So the highly movable ones are the ones we spend the most time on. So the shoulder and elbow and hip and knee, ankle, and so on. Okay, so muscles themselves also vary in size and shape and function. It's interesting to study the attachment point of muscles. The attachment point of muscles gives you a clue as to their function. So you look at how the fibers and fascicles, fascicle is a bundle of muscle fibers. So you look at how the fascicle, this bundle of muscle fibers, and the alignment, it gives you a clue as to what the function of that muscle is. So we'll go over some examples today. Most sources state that there are over 650 skeletal muscles. Some sources go as high as 840. You'll learn a lot of those. Most of the ones we talk about are the ones involved with movement. So tiny little muscles that are involved in swallowing or producing speech, we don't talk about those as much as ones that help move your body. So muscles that act on the different areas that we talked about. So the real force-producing muscles of the body is what our focus will be. So in order to do that, we have to have a reference position. So we have to have standardized ways of talking about movement. So why is that important to have a standard way of talking about things?
So everyone's on the same basis?
Yes. So think how confusing it would be if we all had different terms to describe the same thing. So in the same way, in kinesiology, we have a reference position, and then we have terms that we use to describe movement. So promoting consistency and understanding. And so two positions, anatomical position and fundamental position. So there's only one difference between these two. Does anyone know? So some of this maybe you've heard in a different class, like 105, way back. So anatomical is basically just standing with your palms forward, whereas fundamental is palms are facing your sides. So palms up is what we call a supinated position. So maybe some of you have heard that term before. And then with the palms in neutral, facing the sides, that would be the fundamental position. So that's the only difference. So this would be the which one? Anatomical, right? Hands are supinated. Okay, it's most widely used, so just think palms facing forward. And then the palms are facing the body in the fundamental. Okay, so let's start getting into some directional terms here. So we have 8 basic directional terms, and these terms come in pairs, and they mean opposite things. So we can also combine these terms together. So when we talk about anterior, we're talking about in front in relation to another structure. So anterior means to the front. The opposite of anterior is posterior. So you can see in parentheses here, there's also ventral and dorsal. Those are acceptable terms, but I would say anterior and posterior are used most often. So we can also combine these terms like antero-inferior or antero-superior. So in front and below, or in front and above. So inferior means below, superior means above, so we can combine those terms to describe structures in relation to each other. Okay, so in the same way, anterolateral and anteromedial. Okay, so if we take a look here, this is the top of the tibia. So if we remove the femur, this is an example of a right tibia. So the condyles at the bottom of the femur articulate with these receptacles. So these receptacles are formed by the medial and lateral meniscus. So these receptacles improve the stability of the knee joint by increasing that depth. So it's kind of like they form sockets for the condyles of the femur. And so we can divide the top of the tibia into quadrants. Okay, so we can call, up here we can call this, remember this is a right tibia. So if we're looking down on a right tibia, this would be the anterolateral quadrant. So in front and to the outside. This would be the posterolateral quadrant. So to the back and outside. So up here, this would be on the inside of the right tibia. So anteromedial would be to the front and to the inside. This would be posteromedial to the back and to the inside. So speaking of this new ligament, so 2013, some knee surgeons in Belgium were the first to classify this new ligament that previously had been unknown. There was a hint in the literature way back from 1879 about this ligament, but it was never officially defined or named. And so they called it the anterolateral ligament. So of course, a lot of the athletes I'm sure have heard of the anterior cruciate ligament, or ACL. This ligament has a very similar function and is in close proximity to the ACL, so the anterolateral ligament. So that's what this ligament is right here. Right here, the anterolateral ligament. So there's a short article right here. I'd like you just to read it. It's about, honestly, it's about 3 paragraphs. I just want you to learn about how the anterolateral ligament came to be named back in 2013. So that article, you can just hold down the control key and click on it, or however you're able to do that. And the article opens here, and it's just a very short few paragraphs. So I'll give you a couple minutes just to scan through that. Can you believe all the way to 2013, and there was a ligament that we really hadn't defined? Yeah, you wonder. But honestly, I hadn't heard of the ALL. I wonder if you don't tear your LCL, if you wouldn't like to tear that one. It sounds like it. So maybe a risk factor for ACL tear would be what's stated here. Subsequent research shows that pivot shift, the giving way of the knee in patients with an ACL tear, is caused by injury in the ALL ligament. So there might be a relationship between the incidence of an ACL tear and then injury to the anterior lateral ligament as well. So there seems to be a connection between those two. So kind of neat. I didn't know about that till 2013. Okay, so a few more anatomical terms. So we can put posterior with those same terms and relate to different structures. So I won't provide an example of each one, but posterior inferior, so behind or to the back and below. So the example, so describing the location of the gastrocnemius relative to the knee joint would be, or in relation to the patella would be an example there. Posterior and superior together, so posterior superior, so behind and above, so the hamstrings in relation to the patella. So it's just these 8 terms that we have, we put them together so that we can describe structures, whether it be a joint or a muscle, structures in relation to each other. Okay, so some other directional terminology that's important. This will come up as we do the functional movement screen next week. So contralateral is pertaining to the opposite side. So there's a test that you'll do that assesses rotary stability with the functional movement screen. And so with the functional movement screen, there are 7 different tests, and you get a score from 0 to 3. So if you're really functional, 7 tests times a score of 3 would give you 21 points, right? So last year we had a few 21s. So I'm hoping, that's a U. So there appears to be a relationship between your FMS score and risk of injury. So it's been shown that if you have a score of 14 or less, there tends to be a higher incidence of injury sometime down the road. So it's not the be-all, end-all, but there seems to be a relationship there between these different movement patterns that we look at and risk of injury. So the rotary stability, if you're able to, I'll show a picture here in a moment, but a score of 2 would be you're able to do the contralateral version of this test. And again, I'll show a picture so you can see exactly what that means. Ipsilateral, so that's on the same side. So whenever I try this one, I just fall over. So I need to work on that. So ipsilateral, you start working on it today. Score of 3 if you're able to do the ipsilateral version. And it's hard, it's pretty tough. Bilateral, so what is the prefix bi means what? 2, yeah, so that means both limbs, arms or legs working at the same time. So here's your picture, and as we do these labs, I'll bring copies of what you need, so please don't waste all the paper that you have in your printer at home. I'll bring you a packet with everything you need for each lab. So save your toner. Let's just use the school's printer and I'll bring you copies. Okay, so rotary stability test. So you're in a 4-point position, and a score of 3 means that you can take your right elbow, touch it to your left, or to your right knee, so same side, right? So ipsilateral, right elbow to right knee, and then you're able to fully extend the right arm and the right hip at the same time. So start practicing. So contralateral, which most people do okay. Most people do okay with contralateral. So this would be opposites. So the right elbow to the left knee on that one, and then extending out. And then inability to perform a diagonal repetition. So if you're struggling with this part, but you're close, then that would be a score of 1. So with the functional movement screen, a 0 would be if you have pain. So if you flex the spine here and your low back really hurts, then that's when you would just assign a score of 0. So we don't want pain with any of these tests. Okay. And no, your lab grade doesn't depend on how high your FMS score is. Okay, so some other terminology here. So inferior, we can look at examples like the infraspinatus muscle. So remember, inferior means below. So what we're talking about are two muscles of the rotator cuff complex. So the rotator cuff consists of 4 muscles, and there's 2 on the posterior side. That's the infraspinatus and teres minor. There's 1 on the top, that's the supraspinatus. And then you can see just around the front side, so the anterior side, there's the subscapularis. So the reason these are called the rotator cuff is all of these tendons converge on the proximal portion of the humerus. So it kind of forms a cuff. So it provides stability by keeping the humeral head in the correct position within the glenoid socket. So this is the glenoid socket you can kind of see here. It's part of the scapula. So we'll get into all this in chapter 4, but just kind of a brief introduction. So why do we call it the infraspinatus? It's a muscle that is below the spine of scapula. So this is the spine of scapula, and then the infraspinatus is below. So it would make sense that the supraspinatus is above the spine of scapula. So, so sometimes muscles are named according to their location. Cephalic is another term. So cephalic means, literally means the head. So we have one of the main blood vessels that exits the arch of the aorta is called the brachiocephalic artery. And so we see that here with the term cephalic. So that provides the right side of the head, the right side of the neck, and the right upper extremity. So you'd have arteries that branch from this brachiocephalic artery, like the subclavian and carotid here. Okay, so this is the last slide that's heavy on these anatomical terms. So just as long as you can identify what it means. So inferior lateral, okay, so below towards the outside. The example I provided here, inferomedial, the medial tibial condyle. So this is the medial tibial condyle right here, relative to the patella would be inferomedial in relation to each other. Superolateral, superomedial. Let's see. There we go. Okay, so let's get into some muscles here. So what we have here, 2 terms that describe muscles. This is very important because you have several layers of muscles. So especially on the posterior side of the torso, you have about 5 layers of muscles till you get down to the actual vertebrae themselves. So there's lots of muscle back there. So how many of you have a foam roller at home? So nice at the end of the day just to lay back in your living room and roll all that out. You have so much tissue back there that can just get tight and all bound up. So we want to release that with some nice rolling. So the example given here, deep versus superficial. So superficially, we have the trapezius. So the trapezius is a very large muscle. It has 3 sections with fascicles. What's the definition of a fascicle again? Yeah, a bundle of fibers. So maybe some of you have heard my analogy in another class. So take a handful of spaghetti. That's a fascicle. So each of those uncooked spaghetti noodles is a muscle fiber. And so if you have a handful of fibers, that's a fascicle. So a whole muscle is made up of fascicles. So you're taking several handfuls of spaghetti and just binding them together to make a whole muscle. So we have three different sections here. We have the upper part, and so the fascicles are kind of running in a superior and medial direction, so superior-medial direction. We have the middle part, and so you can see those fibers are running more in a medial direction. And then we have the lower part of the trapezius. So notice how the lower part, the fibers are running kind of in a downward direction. So these boards are really sensitive. They'll switch if I get too close. So kind of in an infero-medial direction for the lower fibers. So all of these parts have different functions and different neural innervation. So isn't it interesting that one muscle can have three different parts or three distinct regions, each of which is innervated by a different nerve? So that's fascinating to me. So if we peel off the trapezius, right underneath we have other muscles. So right underneath the middle part of the trapezius, we have the rhomboids. The rhomboids also has two parts. It has a minor, which is kind of, you can almost see them separated here. The minor part is this little thin region up here, and then the major part is down below. So that's the other thing with muscles is usually if you have, say, a minor part, there's usually also a major part. Can you think of any other examples? Yeah, teres minor and teres major is right. So when we describe the rhomboids, we could say the rhomboids are deep to the middle region of the trapezius. Or alternatively, the middle region of the trapezius is superficial to the rhomboids. Okay, proximal and distal. Trying to come up with some examples here. Proximal sometimes refers to the origin of muscles. So lots of muscles, not all, but a lot of them have two attachment points. There's an origin and an insertion. So the origin, we say, is more proximal. The insertion of a muscle, we say, is more distal. So the biceps. So how many parts does the biceps have? Two, right? So there's a long head. Okay, the long head is more lateral. So the long head is more to the outside. So the long head has this tendon that goes all the way up and goes all the way into the inside of the shoulder capsule. So throwing athletes, athletes that serve volleyballs really fast can sometimes get strains of this long biceps tendon because it has a function inside the shoulder capsule for shoulder stability. Okay, the short head is outside the shoulder capsule. The short head actually attaches here to the coracoid process. So you can see that it's a little bony prominence right here, and so this short head comes up and attaches right there. So you can see that, you know, the middle of the biceps, but then it kind of splits into parts that have their respective attachments proximally. So that's the origin. So the insertion is all the way down here. So can you see how these two parts converge when they get down here? And so the attachment point is down here on the radius, like somewhere like on the radial tuberosity is where that distal insertion is. So most of the time when we think about that muscle, we think of it as, what's its function? Primarily. What do we think of when we think of biceps? Elbow what? Elbow flexion. That's usually, for most muscles, we think about their function in terms of where they have their insertion. So down here near the elbow, elbow flexion. Less often we think about a muscle, how it functions up here at the origin. So the function of this part of the biceps up here is actually to flex and to abduct the shoulder. So this is getting ahead, chapter 6 material, but just to kind of give you an introduction, does everybody understand what proximal and distal means? Okay, all right, so let's keep going. Other ways of thinking about proximal and distal, joints. So everybody look at your forearm, your right or left forearm. So between the elbow and the wrist, you have two joints. You have a proximal radial ulnar joint, and you have a distal radial ulnar joint. So the radial ulnar joint between the radius, which is lateral, and the ulna, which is medial. So when you go from a supinated position, in a supinated position, like you see here with the right arm, how would you describe the position of the radius relative to the ulna? What anatomical directional terms would you use? The position of the radius? What's the word for outside? Lateral. So the radius is lateral to the ulna. Okay. Now when you go from supination and turn your palm down, what do we call that action as we turn our palm down? Pronation is right. So what happens is you have this sling type arrangement here with the annular ligament that wraps around the radial head. And so the head of the radius spins within this radial notch on the ulna. And so as you go from supination to pronation, you have this pivoting type action where the radius actually pivots over the top of the ulna. So in a pronated position, the ulna is now on the lateral side, and the radius is pivoted over here more to the medial. So ligaments allow bones to be stable as we go from pronation and supination and so on. So just another way of thinking about proximal and distal. Okay, so radius is lateral to the ulna is medial to the radius, so just another look there. Okay, so prone and supine. So we're going to do anatomical terms to death today. So prone and supine. So prone, we describe the body as a whole, okay, so lying on the stomach. So trying to pull practical examples here. So Superman, so how many show of hands have done these at some point? Yeah, okay. So supine, lying on the back. Okay, so lying on your back, total body, supine, and so we could do V-ups would be an example there. So, okay, all right. So 3 terms related to spinal alignment. So kyphosis, lordosis, scoliosis. So kyphosis is extra curvature in the thoracic part of the spine. Extra curvature in the thoracic part. So the thoracic spine is a little bit concave. Kyphosis is a lot of curvature, more than there should be. Lordosis is curvature of the lumbar spine. Scoliosis is lateral curvature. So let's take a look here. So if you were to look at someone's posture, say from a sagittal view, and you see how the segments of the body line up relative to this line all the way down. So this is good alignment. And then these other 3 would be misalignment. So that's things that we're trying to do better and to do better with our posture. So kyphosis, lordosis, they oftentimes go together. So you have extra curvature in the thoracic part. You can see comparing this versus this, and then extra curvature in the lumbar part. So this versus this. Flat back posture. This is actually less curvature in both parts, the thoracic and lumbar. And then sway back is kind of just kyphosis, but the lumbar spine is in the normal position. Scoliosis is over here. You can view that from more of a frontal view. And so that's the lateral curvature here on the spine. So out of all of these, the one that tends to be congenital, what does that word congenital mean? Born with it, okay? This one, scoliosis, okay? The others tend to develop because of occupations or just normal, just daily activities where you're in one position for an extended period of time. So muscles begin to get tight, muscles begin to get weak, some muscles are overactivated, some muscles are underactivated, and pretty soon you're starting to develop these postures. So that's why we do all this postural correction. We'll talk about it in lab. Okay, so more terms. So valgus and varus. How many have heard of one or both of these? Valgus or varus. Funny words. Who makes up all these anatomical terms? So valgus is a knock, like a knock-knee position, outward angulation of a distal segment. So the knees provide a good example. Varus, inward angulation. So bow legs would be an example there. So valgus, here's several examples. And in still frames of doing a drop jump or a counter movement jump or a change of direction. So you can see the difference between the knee is collapsing inward, so there's very poor alignment between the hip and the knee. And then so hopefully after an intervention, you'd have much better alignment. So you see the difference in how those joints line up in this picture versus this picture. So a lot of times we experience more force in the landing part of a jump versus the takeoff part. So the landing part, you have to deal with impact. So the way that your body absorbs impact can determine the risk for injury. If you're not very good at absorbing impact, then there's going to be excess stress on ligaments, muscles, and tendons. So this shows just some still frames here of valgus knee collapse in landing. Same thing here. You can have these misalignments in very high-level athletes. High-level athletes can function really well with misalignment. The problem is eventually there's an increased risk for injury. So this person was a phenomenal athlete. Do we know who that is? Robert Griffin III. Okay. Phenomenal athlete. But what was the issue that kind of took him out of the NFL?
His knee.
ACL, yeah. So it's with misalignment, you still can function at a very high level, but you're opening yourself up to a high risk for injury. So that's when we have to do these corrective exercises to get better alignment while maintaining that high level of performance. So from a standing position, you can even observe these misalignments. So you can see here the hips are internally rotated and adducted, and what happens is if this is the femur and this is the tibia, you have the tibia that starts to rotate out like that. So the tibia turns out like that, and then you've got, so tibial external rotation and then ankle pronation. So the weight of your body is being supported more on the inside or the medial part of your foot. So my whole purpose with this semester is to help you realize how parts of the body are connected. So if you have an imbalance up in the hips, it's likely that you probably also will have something going on with the knees, something going on with the feet. So usually if we can correct things that are imbalanced here in the center of the body, guess what happens with joints that are below that? They tend to be better aligned. So your body is a series of connected segments. If you have one segment that's out of alignment, that's going to cause another segment to overcompensate, which causes another segment to overcompensate, and pretty soon you have all kinds of problems. So all of this down here, these things are symptoms of imbalance that could originate up here in the hips. So that lumbopelvic region, right around in here, if we can correct those imbalances, then it's easier to get better alignment all the way down. So how many have heard of the kinetic chain concept? Kinetic chain concept, so force chain. Kinetic means force. So your body is literally, it's like a chain. It's a series of segments that are connected by joints. So we want to have balance in the way that we develop and so that all the segments are properly aligned to reduce injury risk. So that's why we do, this is just a small example, that's why we do all this kind of stuff. So how many show of hands have done something similar all the time? Okay, so it all originates back to trying to prevent misalignment. So I want you to watch the right knee here. Can you see what's happening there with the gait? So you're watching, can you see how the knee is deviating laterally? Okay, so that's placing a lot of stress on the medial side of the knee. So the medial femoral condyle, medial tibial condyle is contacting like this. So over time, that's going to wear down all that cartilage on both these surfaces and can result in arthritis, probably eventually knee replacement with this kind of problem. So alignment's really, really important, and strengthening everything in this region is important because then we have alignment all the way down. Okay, so any questions so far before we move on to planes? Okay. All right, planes of motion. What are they? Planes, an imaginary two-dimensional surface through which the body or segment of the body is moved. So each plane has an axis, has a 90-degree relationship to the plane. Okay, so these are our three cardinal planes of motion. So we have the sagittal, the frontal, and the transverse. Now, various textbooks, including the one we use for this class, also have some other names here. So anterior, posterior for the sagittal, coronal or lateral for the frontal, horizontal for the transverse. Doesn't matter to me which term you use. So if we get it on an exam and you can't remember frontal, but you can remember lateral, perfectly fine. So pick one that works for you and go with that one for you. So there's more than one name for each plane. Okay, so now I want some engagement. So determine the planes in which body segments move in the following activities. So you're not going to write anything down yet to turn in, but just tell me. Running upstairs. Okay, well, let me back up. So sagittal plane activities, think forward and backward movement. Forward and backward movement. That could be the body as a whole, or that can be parts of the body like the legs. Forward and backward movement. We call that flexion and extension. So frontal plane is side to side. So that can be one part of the body like the shoulder, so the shoulder or the hip, or it can be more the body as a whole like the torso, so side to side. Okay, so frontal plane is side to side, sagittal is forwards and backwards, transverse is rotation. So rotation, okay, so torso rotation, we can do shoulder rotation. So, ask you again, so running upstairs, we're getting that forwards and backwards movement, flexion and extension of the legs. So what plane would that be? Sagittal, yes. Okay, turning a knob to open a door. You might think transverse, but okay, so remember the orientation. Okay, so the sagittal plane divides the body into right and left halves. So we're talking about forwards and backwards movement. Transverse plane divides the body into superior and inferior halves. So we're talking about rotation, okay, around the body. Frontal plane divides the body into anterior and posterior halves. So side to side movement. Okay, so again, turning a knob to open doors. So you're not opening the door from down here. What if I was down here opening the door? That would be transverse, okay, because it's around the body this way. But if I reach forward like this, yes, frontal, side to side, side to side. That's in the frontal plane. That's here, side to side motion. Okay, nodding the head to agree. So flexion, extension is sagittal. Yes, good, Brian. Okay, shaking the head to disagree. Okay, so remember, here, that's not this. I can do this. Yeah, transverse, around. Okay, shuffling the body from side to side. So the body as a whole, side to side is frontal. Yeah. Okay, some more examples. Sagittal or anterior posterior plane, front to back movement. Okay, so again, my classes I like. What's the practical application? So why is this important? How can you use it? Okay, so sagittal movements. Leg raises. Okay, that's forwards and backwards movement. Reverse hyperextensions. Okay, again, forwards and backwards movement. Common movements in the sagittal plane include flexion and extension. So remember that, flexion and extension, common movements in the sagittal plane. Okay, frontal plane, lateral or coronal plane. So we're out to the sides of the body. So, and this is exciting. We got a new motion capture system over the summer. So that's going to create some nice labs. We still need to learn how to use it, but we're working on that. So if you look in 134, if you look at different locations, there are now 6 cameras that are set up to do this type of stuff. So in this case, we're talking about the shoulders out to the sides of the body. So this type of pull-up, you're out, right? You're out to the sides, like this. Okay, what about if I did this type of pull-up? Now what plane would it be? It's not frontal. Frontal is out here. What's in here? Yeah, it'd be sagittal. Shoulder press. Okay, overhead press. So you're out here, and then you're pressed. So your arms are out to the side is the whole point. Transverse, axial, or horizontal plane. Okay, so application. So rotation is the application of that. But again, it doesn't have to be the whole body. It can be just like your shoulder can rotate as well, or your hip. If I can get this stuff, there we go. Okay, so diagonal plane. We get into sport specificity here. So diagonal plane involves a combination of planes. So it's not purely front to back, not purely side to side, not purely rotation, but it's kind of a combination. So it's a diagonal pattern. Think about throwing is a diagonal pattern, especially as you follow through with a throw. A golf swing or a football punt. We could follow a high diagonal pattern or a low diagonal pattern. High diagonal is going from high to low, like a throw. Low diagonal pattern is going from low to high. So I'll show you some examples here. So high diagonal pattern through the diagonal plane of motion. So what's the practical application? So what might you see that would be applied here? So how many have done this type of thing with chops? Cable chops or with a band. That's the application. Okay, low diagonal. Same thing. Okay, but we've changed the pattern. So now we're going from low to high. So low to high up here. Okay, so as I said, movement through a plane revolves around an axis. So there's a 90-degree relationship between a plane of motion and its associated axis. So I want you to think of the axis as like the axle. So here we have a wheel on this side and a wheel on this side. And what do those wheels rotate around? An axle. It's the same thing with movement. The axle for the wheels represents the axis about which our body segment moves. So whenever these wheels rotate, like we could have an arm or a leg that rotates like a wheel, the axis has this 90-degree relationship. The axle has a 90-degree relationship to the wheels. The axis has a 90-degree relationship to the limb that we're moving. So the frontal axis is for movements that occur in the sagittal plane. So this is the plane, and this is the axis. So if I was to flex the shoulder joint, okay, that's in the sagittal plane. I'm flexing and extending the shoulder joint, flexion and extension. The axis runs at a 90-degree relationship. So think of it like an axle. And so the wheels of the axle, the wheels rotate about the axle just like my shoulder joint rotates about this imaginary axis. So this can apply to the body as a whole, as you see here, or it can apply to just individual joints. Okay, the sagittal axis for movements in the frontal plane. Okay, so common movements in the frontal plane include abduction and adduction. So here's the frontal plane. So for the body as a whole, the axis, which goes through the center of the body, about the level of the umbilicus, and if I'm doing something like this and I'm bending to the side, lateral flexing, okay, this is in the frontal plane around this sagittal axis. So if I was to do this with my shoulder, so if I was to go up here and then back down here, so this is abduction, AB, abduction, and then AD, adduction. Okay, the axis runs this way. So this is the sagittal axis around which the arm abducts and adducts. Does that make sense? Okay. Any questions at this point? Okay, all right, let's keep going. How are we doing on time? Okay, we're good. We're gonna go a little bit long. Let's go about 15 more minutes and then call it a day. So, vertical axis for movements in the transverse plane. So in this case, the axis comes down through the head or down through the joint. So if I was to do this with my torso, if I was to stand here and rotate this way and rotate this way, that's transverse plane around the vertical or longitudinal axis. If I was to take my shoulder and do this type of thing, okay, that's transverse plane, the axis goes down through the shoulder, and I'm rotating it around that axis for the transverse plane. So common movements include internal as well as external rotation. Let's see. There we go. Okay. So for the diagonal plane, it's the diagonal or oblique axis. So diagonal plane, diagonal or oblique axis. So again, just that 90-degree relationship to the plane of motion. Okay, so let's do a little activity here. So as an introduction to the skeletal system, this is 5 participation points for the day. So just, half a sheet of paper or whatever is fine. I want you to open this link. So it will look like this. And then the questions are on the next slide. So if you'd be willing to just answer these 6 questions. So here's another bone that I really didn't know about until I started studying this. How many have heard of the fibella? Fibella, F-A-B-E-L-L-A. Actually, that's awesome. I didn't know until I read this. So give you a few minutes to go through the article and answer those questions. You can please work together. Talk to each other. Getting close. Yeah.
Good. I'm trying to get the root compound.
I wonder how you could find out whether you have a fibella or not. Without an X-ray, if you can tell. Back there in the lateral gastrocnemius. I don't feel anything. So. No fibella for me.
So is it in the popliteal space or is it below it?
It's in the tendon of the lateral gastrocnemius. I think I have a picture. Right there. This is the fibella. You, Tyler, do you know? You have a fibella? Oh, sure. You, Brandy? I feel like Only 39% of us have a fibella.
Does it have a function?
We'll get to that. It's a sesamoid bone. Most sesamoid bones have a function. We'll talk about it. Pretty easy read. So Ashley, you knew about it. Is that because you had an x-ray and found it?
No, we talked about it last semester in class. It might have been
Oh.
wishing for.
Okay. So I'll ask for these at the end of class today. We still have a little bit to do. Down there in Casper, was it? Gillette. And it's many grounds and trailers parked out here. Anybody need a little more time? Okay. You got your run done already, Brian?
Yeah, we finished 5:30 this morning.
Well, that's smart. Is it a record high today? Seems like maybe.
Yeah, that's why we did it so late.
Yeah.
Thanks for the long rest today.
All right, so I'm just going to talk a little bit more. Anyone who needs a little more time, just go ahead and finish up. So the fibella is one of several sesamoid bones in the body. Sesamoid bones are bones that are embedded in tendons, and so their function is to give greater mechanical advantage. So anybody know the largest sesamoid bone in the body? The patella, and so the patella gives greater advantage to the quadriceps. So the quadriceps is able to generate greater torque because of a greater moment arm that's afforded by the patella. So I have a picture coming up that'll show you what I mean. Torque is made up of two parts. There's a force part and a moment arm part. So we can increase the force that a muscle produces, or we can increase its leverage. And so Ashley was in biomechanics, so we talked all about leverage. And so what sesamoid bones do is increase the leverage. of a muscle. So for a given amount of force, you're able to get greater torque because of the greater moment arm from an sesamoid bone.
So would that be for the hamstring then?
This would be for the gastrocnemius. So there. So one thing people don't realize is the gastrocnemius is also a knee flexor. So we think a gastrocnemius is just being a plantar flexor at the ankle, but it also contributes to flexion at the knee joint. So my guess is it's helping with knee flexion. So it assists the hamstrings with knee flexion, and so you're getting a little bit more leverage for the gastrocnemius with this sesamoid bone, is my guess. Okay, so osteology, the adult skeleton, okay, 206 bones. That can vary, especially when we're born, because a lot of the bones haven't fused together yet. So bones start out as cartilage, and then what's the word that, as minerals are added, what's that word? Minerals are added to cartilage, and yeah, ossification is right. So the axial skeleton has 80 bones, appendicular has 126. So the reason that the appendicular has so many more is because it includes the hands and the feet. So in each hand you have 27 bones, in each foot you have 26. So if you count just the hands and feet, that's 106 bones. And so there's lots of smaller bones, carpals and tarsals and so on, that we get a lot more bones in the appendicular. Okay, functions, protection, okay, vital organs, support for posture, okay, movement, serving as attachment points for tendons, okay, storage of minerals, okay, so calcium and phosphorus, and hemopoiesis. So that's highlighted in yellow. I guarantee you on the first exam I'll ask you that. So hemopoiesis, that's a good word to know. So formation of red blood cells. So red blood cells have to be reproduced every 120 days. So all the blood in your body is recycled quite frequently. So you have to have enough iron in your diet. So you get iron through, you need at least 20 milligrams a day. So a lot of people get that through a supplement or by eating red meat. So types of bones, long bones, a couple examples here. So humerus and fibula. Short bones, carpals and tarsals. Flat, ribs and scapula. So lots of area for attachment with flat bones. Irregular bones, so these have unique shapes and have unique functions. So the bones of the pelvis and the skull. Sesamoid bones, so we talked about a little bit about those. So long bones, think leverage. Generally, a baseball pitcher will have an advantage if they have longer arms. So it's a longer lever. So they're able to build up all this force that eventually transfers out through the kinetic chain of their arm to where the ball is released. And so a longer armed pitcher has it as an inherent advantage velocity-wise. Let's talk about another application here. So that's the common theme in this class. We always come back to how can you apply it. So maybe some of you have experienced this. So here are two females, and they are equal in height. But do you notice anything different about their body segments? So their stature is the same. This female on the right has a short torso and a very long femur. This female on the left has a long torso and a short femur. So how many of you have ever thought about this in relation to squat ability? The ability to do squats well, and at least achieve this parallel position where the crease of your hip is below the top of your patella. Can it be affected by the length of your body segments. Which of these structures is more suitable for squatting really well?
Short femur.
Long torso, short femur by far. How many of you know someone with a really long femur? The distance between the hip and the knee is just unusually long. That's a tough path to get to the point where you have enough core strength to squat all the way to parallel. So for a person with a really long femur to reach parallel, it's a lot more rotation and a lot more adjustment with the pelvis versus someone that has a very short femur. So looking in depth, something that might seem really pretty straightforward and simple, there's a lot to it, and a lot can depend on individual variation. So you might look at these two and think, well, it should be okay, but there can be a real difference. So this person is going to have a lot more stability to keep the back protected with a long femur, because they have to travel a greater distance to reach the same amount of hip flexion in a squat. So just something to consider. Okay, so deadlift, long femur versus short femur. So that can affect your setup here as well. Okay, so a longer femur, you're going to have more of a parallel back position versus a short femur where you're going to be a little more upright. Okay, so that can affect which muscles are used more to get the weight off the ground. So in this position right here, if you have a really long femur, you're going to be sitting back a little bit more, and so you're going to be using more glutes and hamstrings to get the bar off the ground. Whereas this position over here, it's going to be a little more quadricep dominant because you're in a more upright position. Your quadriceps are going to be more engaged to get that bar moving off the ground. So this position with someone with a short femur, their setup on a traditional barbell is more like a hex bar. How many have done hex bar deadlifts? Yeah, so that hex bar deadlifts in particular are a lot more quadricep dominant because you're in this more upright position. So if you're someone with a longer femur, sometimes the hex bar is a good alternative because you're going to place less stress on your low back here. There's less torque on your low back versus someone else. So it does make a difference how you're built. It's not just your total height, but what goes into that would determine your optimal selection. Okay, so a couple more slides here. Short bones. Okay, so we're talking about carpals and tarsals. So these 8 bones that make up your wrist, 7 bones that make up the base of your foot. There's a lot of gliding and adjustment that takes place in these bones. So this gives you a color-coded picture of all of these carpal bones. And these carpal bones are stressed to a great degree when we do grip exercises. How many do exercises just to train your grip? So you have this nice solid steel grip. So how many have used a fat grip device to improve your grip? Yeah, they're just awesome. So I was trying to think of, again, the application, and I came up with this study done back in 2018, so 4 years ago. So the effects of fat grip training on muscle strength and driving performance in Division I male golfers. And so it's a very interesting study. What they did is mostly a barbell type program, excuse me, but they had one group do all their barbell lifts with fat grips on the bar. They had the other group do their barbell training with just a normal barbell, no fat grips, for 8 weeks. And these are obviously high-level golfers, Division I golfers. So you can read through some of the abstract, but just the results here. So 8-week periodized resistance training. Okay. So the FG group, so the fat grip group demonstrated significant increases in ball speed, carry, drive distance, and left-hand grip strength after 8 weeks of resistance training. So in a population such as low handicap Division I male golfers, fat grip training may allow for athletes to increase golf-specific performance after 8 weeks of periodized resistance training. So strength and conditioning coaches may use fat grip training over the course of a training program with athletes who require adequate grip strength to elicit further adaptation. So what a great study, right? Yeah, so that the application is so important. So we can take this little tool and we can change the way we do things just a little bit to get that extra edge. So if everyone's lifting barbells, why not add something like that? Just that little adjustment, and then you can make even get that little bit of an edge, because everybody's looking for that edge. That's what makes the difference with winning. So, okay, so let's stop right here for today. Do we have any questions? Okay, so before I forget, let me just go around and collect your, and then what are we doing Monday for lab at 8 o'clock? For those of you in on Monday's lab? Functional movement screen, so come ready.
I was sitting here and I couldn't get my time to work and I thought this whole time it was on the battery. Wait. It's quadruple A battery.
Get it to work.
Yeah, I've been sitting here and I'm like, it could work, and I thought it was just a sensor. No, it has a battery and it's a quadruple A battery. I don't even know where you can get those. I'm like, that's annoying. I was sitting here and I was trying to write notes and I thought my computer would work, but no, it's a pen.
Well, at least it's a pen.
Right? My computer. So now I'm on the,
Yeah, see you later.
now I'm on the hunt for quadruple A batteries.